Hello, students. We're going to start topic 5, looking at the 1920s, particularly as a decade of change. And in this first lesson, we're going to kind of go over U.S. government policy, both domestic and foreign. And in short, U.S. domestic policy was largely pro-business, and our foreign policy is one designed to promote isolationism, sort of a retreating from the world stage. Domestic policy means how we handle things at home, and primarily I'm going to focus on the economic policies of, the two men that we see in the upper left and upper right-hand corners, Presidents Harding and Coolidge, but largely our policy is shaped by the man in the middle there, who was Secretary of Treasury during both administrations. That's Andrew Mellon. They tended to follow a very laissez-faire policy towards business to try to promote economic growth. Coolidge sometimes referred to this as a return to normalcy after World War I, an attempt to sort of retreat domestically away from some of the progressivism that we had seen in the decades prior to the First World War, and really kind of go back to the very pro-big business policies that we saw in the late 19th century. And in fact, Coolidge is the guy who's often credited with saying the business of the American government is business. So we'll see several policies put into place that will be designed to help business grow and to help the economy grow overall. They will create the Bureau of Budget, which makes recommendations on the budget, and they cut spending severely in this time. Now, there was a great deal more spending in World War I because we were at war. The height was about $18 billion, and during the Harding administration, they cut that down to about $3 billion, which was a big, big cut in how much the government spent. And that means that it created sort of a budget surplus, or a surplus of tax dollars in the Treasury. The Fordney-McCumber tariff raised taxes on imports by 25%, and this will help U.S. businesses in selling their products in the United States because foreign products are made more expensive. However, the problem that comes with this is that other nations like Britain and France are going to retaliate against the United States by putting tariffs of their own on U.S. goods, which then makes it more difficult for American businesses to sell their products in those countries. And overall, this tariff war is going to weaken the international economy, and it's going to contribute to the 1930s Great Depression. In addition, they will deregulate businesses, meaning they eliminate a lot of those controls put in place, sometimes to protect workers' rights, sometimes to prevent the formation of monopolies, whereas previous progressive presidents had been very aggressive about going after monopolistic practices. Harding and Coolidge and later Hoover will really kind of back off on that and allow business a little bit more free rein. And this is going to increase profits for those businesses and kind of contributes, along with the tax cuts we're going to see, to the overall amping up of the U.S. economy in this time period, which is good on an overall level, primarily for the businesses. It's not necessarily going to be that great for the workers. And lastly, Mellon used what he called scientific taxation. Mellon didn't really like the income tax that had been implemented during Wilson's presidency, but he didn't want to get rid of it altogether. He still thought the U.S. should primarily draw a lot of its tax revenue from tariffs, so we got the very high tariff that we saw before. But he's going to cut the tax rate on the top income level. So the very rich see their upper level tax bracket decrease, as well as cutting taxes on corporations. And this is going to actually lead to more money in the Treasury because as businesses do better, they're earning more money overall. And even though they're paying less of a tax as a percentage on it, there's actually more money overall coming in. And the same with wealthy people. They move their money into less safe areas that are going to be higher generating in profits, which means that overall they're putting more money into the U.S. Treasury. Harding's administration, more than Coolidge's, is known for some pretty high-level scandals. And this is because Harding himself was a nice guy, a well-liked guy, but he wasn't exactly the brightest guy in the world. And so he left a lot of the decision-making, the complex decision-making, up to his advisors, some of whom were pretty corrupt. The man in charge of the Bureau of Veterans Affairs overcharged for things like putting in floors in the office and furniture and all this other stuff to the taxpayers, because it was taxpayer money, wasted all sorts of taxpayer money in this, and then also pocketed a lot of the extra money from what he had asked for these things. The Attorney General, the top cop, supposed top cop in the United States, the head of the Justice Department, was caught taking bribes from criminals, using his position to take bribes from criminals. But the biggest scandal is the one seen in this political cartoon here, which was the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was one of two areas where there was a great deal of oil under the ground in the United States, and those lands were under the control of the Department of the Navy. So it was oil that was to be used for the Navy. The Secretary of the Interior got Harding to sign over those lands to the Interior Department, and then from there he began doling out drilling rights to oil companies for quote-unquote loans, which were basically bribes. So he's now taking the Navy's oil and, for a bribe, giving it to or selling it to these oil companies. They were caught doing this, and eventually all of the oil reserves were returned to the Navy. But, in the meantime, you've got a Secretary of the Interior giving away the Navy's oil. Another part of Coolidge's supposed return to normalcy after World War I is sort of a retreat from America's role in the world. And we saw this tendency already when the United States did not become a part of the League of Nations or ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And there was another organization created as part of the League of Nations called the World Court, which would settle international disputes. The United States was not a member of that either. But as we go into the 20s, we do see some movement on the foreign policy front towards making treaties with other nations, but these treaties are largely designed to prevent future wars, under the idea that another war could bring the U.S. back into world affairs, that if there was another major war like World War I, that the U.S. would get caught up in it once again. So the ultimate goal here of foreign policy is isolation. The United States not having much to do with any other country outside of trade. And by promoting international peace, the U.S. hoped that would prevent us from getting involved in other countries. So the United States, this cartoon here is illustrating, hosted the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference in 1921 to try and avoid another arms race like we had seen leading up to World War I, which was focused mainly on navies, building bigger and more advanced battleships. And there are several agreements that come out of this, named for the number of nations involved. You've got the Four Powers Pact, which agreed that any land in the Pacific, or disagreements about any lands in the Pacific, any islands in the Pacific, over who controlled them, would be discussed among the four nations involved, U.S., Britain, France, and Japan, the major colonizing powers in the Pacific, before any action was taken. So, to avoid fighting over these islands. The Five Powers Act included those same four powers, and as well as Italy, and this is what's illustrated here. It was a way to reduce the size of the navies. Everybody was going to set a certain limit on their navy, and it was based off of how large navies were relative to each other. So Britain had the largest navy, and then everybody was supposed to be a certain percentage, wherever they were at that point, of Britain's size. So if the U.S. was 80% the size of Britain, we would always remain 80% the size of their navy. So if Britain's navy was reduced, the U.S. had to reduce its. If Britain's navy increased in size, we could increase ours in size. And this was actually beneficial to a lot of countries because they had been holding on to a lot of these old, obsolete ships that they really needed to get rid of, but they were afraid to because they were afraid that their smaller navy would make them more vulnerable, and this provided an opportunity to actually scrap a lot of those navies. And then lastly, the Nine Powers Act agreed to open trade with China. That open door policy the U.S. had been seeking was finally agreed to by all the major nations who had economic relations with China, and that those nations agreed to recognize China's independence as well as its territorial sovereignty. So in other words, they weren't supposed to interfere in China's right to self-rule, and they weren't supposed to take territory from China. Two other important agreements that will come up in this time period. One is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, named for the U.S. Secretary of State and the French Foreign Minister who drew it up. So it was originally done by the U.S. and France, but eventually they would sign on 62 other nations. And they all agreed to outlaw war as a way of settling international disputes. In other words, war is not an implement of diplomacy. If you disagree with somebody, you don't go to war with them. We're going to use diplomatic means of resolving our issues. And this is one of those things where it's an agreement, but there's nothing that's going to, force them to follow this. If any nation doesn't follow this, there's not really much the others can do. It's kind of like the Paris Climate Agreement that the U.S. is part of, and many other nations are part of this too, in that all of us agree to reduce our carbon emissions, but there's no, punitive measures within there for it. It's just something that we're saying, this is a problem, we need to deal with it. Well, in the 1920s, it was war was a problem, we need to deal with it. So let's agree not to use war as sort of our first resort. The thing that's illustrated on here is the sort of crazy cyclical nature of what's called the Dawes Act, or Dawes Plan, sorry, not the Dawes Act. And this was aimed at trying to collect debts from France and Britain they had accrued to the United States in World War I. So by this point, the U.S. has become a creditor nation. We loan out a lot of money to other countries, and we had loaned out a great deal of money to Britain and France in the early stages of the First World War. Well, they could not pay those debts back, and the U.S. insisted on collecting those debts. And France and Britain said we can't collect them because we haven't gotten our reparation payments from Germany, which were owed to them under the Treaty of Versailles, remember, which required Germany to take responsibility for the war and pay reparations. So the U.S. agreed to loan money to Germany, and then Germany would use that money to pay the reparations to France and Britain, and then France and Britain, with their economies back on track, could then pay their debts back to the U.S. Largely, we're kind of paying ourselves, but along the process, we're hoping that we're going to get Britain, France, and Germany's economies back on track, which will allow them to be able to pay us back on their own. All right, looking at your graphic organizer here for this one, the top part deals with domestic policy, the bottom part foreign policy. First of all, for each one, what is the overall primary goal of the U.S. domestic and foreign policy in the 1920s? And then looking at each of those specific actions or agreements in the domestic area, what does it do, what's the effect of it, and how is it helping us to reach the goal that you stated at the top. At the bottom, similarly, who are the nations that are involved in each of those pacts? What does the pact do? What does it agree to? And how is it helping the United States reach its goal in the 1920s of isolation and world peace? So zeroing in here, if we look at like the Bureau of Budget, what does it do? It cut spending from $18 billion to $3 billion. What effect does this have? It creates a surplus of tax dollars in the Treasury. And how is this helping the U.S. accomplish its goal? It allowed them to have extra money they could give tax cuts to businesses. All right, 我你再见。